to give the Cliff Notes version as best I can to let everybody who leaves this series to have a pretty full picture of this crisis and how it's unfolded. And we've been going, through we're actually left off in 56, 57, pretty much a period of silence for about 7 years. One event in 64 we will cover today. And then most of this presentation, 99%, will cover the 1967 or the 6-Day War, which is probably arguably outside the initial creation of the Zionist state that we covered in part 1 and part 2, probably the most important, which shapes the very maps and landscapes that we see today. There was a presidential debate also. I always like to kind of start off with some side news. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. As anyone who ever had the privilege of watching that, I couldn't even finish it all. It was just, even from an entertainment standpoint, it wasn't very entertaining. It was such a scripted mess, and neither one of them answered questions. And as usual in these debates, you're always going to have that question posed, and you have to show everybody, I'm more pro-Israel than you. I love the Zionists more than you. And it's the same type of show that went on this time as well. For anyone who watched it, you definitely saw that. Trump did a typical Republican tactic, which is accuse the Democrats of being anti-Israel. In turn, the Democrats respond, no, we're more pro-Israel than you. And it's just really quite comical. But I did want to throw that in before we begin. What we covered in part 6, pretty much in its entirety, was the Suez crisis. For those of you who missed it, I always recommend go back and watch them. Even though, again, each episode can stand independent. It's a different lesson, but it is a culmination of the buildup of the previous parts. And in part 6, we outlined the Suez crisis. We showed how Egypt had this on their own land, this very key strategical piece of property, basically privatized, and how Nasser basically was able to bring it back into Egyptian hands, power to the people, so to speak. And it was ultimately taken again by war as he closed off the canal, particularly to Israel. And we talked about the ally, emergence coming together, France, England, limited support, but a lot of secret support from the United States. We showed how much of a resounding victory it was as the Allies crushed Egypt. They restored basically the Suez Canal and the passageways through there to Israel. We left off showing how the United States had put pressure on Israel to basically back off. The time to claim it was not yet. They had longer term vision here, and American pressure ultimately would force the Zionists to relinquish control. It was a test run, as I like to call it, for the things that are going to come. Israel demonstrated its dominance, its strength, all the years of acquiring equipment, weaponry, training. We're going to see that on display full force today as we have a full-fledged war. After all the upgrades, after all the time that the Zionists have built, we are going to see just how large that gap became. We saw the Arab addiction to nepotism, and we're going to see that again today as well. That Arabs are their own worst enemy when it comes to organization, when it comes to working together. Everything is based on nepotism. We saw incompetent Egyptian commander after incompetent Egyptian commander promoted to positions of authority, largely due to what we call wasta, in Saudi Arabia and the Arab world, relationships, friendships, family ties. This is not the way you run a military. It's not the way you run anything functionally. But nepotism has always been something that has plagued the Arab world, still a problem to this day. We're going to get back to that, later as well. So we begin with an event that happened in 1964. The Palestinian Liberation Organization would come to exist. It was basically a coalition designed basically to support both the Palestinians in the diaspora, and that's going to grow at the end of this section. You're going to see even more in that diaspora spreading out, if you will, as well as the Palestinians that were in the territories. They had no representation, at this point. Jordan had controlled the West Bank. Egypt had Gaza. The Zionists had controlled everything else, 78% of the land, as we left off. Who was to represent these people? They didn't have a government. So the Palestinian organization would fill that void. They were people without a land. They needed leadership, and that's what this organization was originally founded to do. So officially founded in 1964, the chief goal was for that creation of an Arab state in the territories of the former British mandated Palestine. And again, not to beat the dead horse or repeat over and over again, what was promised to the Arab people under Article 22 of the League of Nations. We've covered that extensively in pretty much every part we've mentioned it. The legal case, for this. Now, the PLO is obviously highly controversial. You hear it throughout the media. They're always depicted with the word terrorism, never necessarily freedom fighters, but terrorist is also, common word there that's used because one of their goals is the elimination of the state of Israel. And as we've highlighted, is that necessarily a bad thing? Israel is illegal. Based on the League of Nations, it never should have existed. We talked about that extensively in part 1, where we said never in history have we seen one group of people take somebody else's land and then say, yeah, we're giving it to these guys over here. And that, in a simple way, is largely what happened. So, of course, the PLO's goal was for this. Should they have accepted this? Should I accept someone to come in and say, oh, well, the neighbor down the street gave my living room and my bedroom to some man I never knew, and say I have to accept this? I have to accept a 2-room solution inside my own home that I lived in and paid all my life. Obviously, everyone would say that's absurd, but that's exactly what faced the Palestinian people. The first summit took place in Cairo in 1964. The Arab League would initiate the creation of this organization to represent the Palestinian people. In Jerusalem on May 28, 1964, the council would hold a meeting, the Palestinian National Council, and the PLO would officially be born on June the 2nd. Now, they exploded on the scene pretty rapidly after that, about a 6-month period here. We would see basically an attack on the national water carrier of Israel in January of 1965. This was a project where the goal was to take water from the Sea of Galilee and it would go into the various Jewish settlements. So the PLO basically would launch attacks on this. Because at this point, there was a new era of Arab resistance that we will see even more after '67 war. Because you're starting to realize that there's absolutely no way you are going to be able to line up on a battlefield and win. It's impossible. They've got the best weapons, more of them, more sophisticated systems, as we are going to see, their radar, their reconnaissance, their training. They're being trained by the best of Western military strategists from the United States, from Great Britain, from France. I mean, these are battle-hardened nations, battle-hardened commanders with years and invaluable experience that was being shared with the Zionists. There was just simply no way that the Arabs knew this time they were going to be able to go toe-to-toe, mano-a-mano with this war machine that was being built. So things started to shift. Now, just how perspective works. When you look at other guerrilla warfare operations where it's the United States allies, they praise it in the media. They call guerrilla warfare to be brave. It's a desperate act of resistance. But we see when the Arabs do it, in this case against the Zionists, it's considered to be terrorism. I mean, there's many examples we can cite of bravery being equated with guerrilla warfare tactics. The Native Americans in the Americas in the fight against the settlers, the colonials, they use guerrilla warfare tactics, and they're praised by modern-day leftist establishments. We see in the American Civil War, where the South was being bombarded by the North, women, children being raped, killed, numerous problems going on in that war, particularly with Sherman's march, and the Southerners were, resorted to guerrilla warfare. And they're often praised by historians for valor, for not giving up, but yet again, when we see something being done to the Zionists, terrorists, all of a sudden guerrilla warfare is considered to be barbaric. So we will be returning frequently to the PLO as this series, not necessarily this part too much, but they have been found at this point. But we are going to be getting big into them in the 1970s when we start getting there. But it was worth noting here before we commence of their foundation in 1964. PLO now exists for the first time. But now we are going to focus on the breadth of this presentation, which is the 1967 war, the most monumental shift in the balance of power. And I've kind of echoed throughout this series that what the Zionists tell you on Monday is not the same as on Tuesday or Wednesday. These people don't mind operating at a snail's pace. They take, bang, they're ready to seize even more. It was always within their plans to have what we're going to talk about here today, to seize these territories. We went through, they were not happy with Jerusalem being considered by the United Nations to be an international city. They didn't like that. They wanted it. They just needed to find an excuse and the time to go there and get it. We are going to see that today, as they are going to claim a lot of these territories they had previously covered. So the Six-Day War can often be considered as part two, the sequel, if you will, to the Sinai Crisis. Same theater, same combatants, same goals in mind. Other thing that time was to liberate the peninsula. This time is to occupy and to take not just the peninsula, but to fortify the borders, both on the West Bank and in Gaza. And as we are going to see later, the Golan Heights, the expansion would move north. The conflict would be fought between the Arab states of Egypt, Syria, Jordan from June 5th, 1967, all the way to June 10th. We will see the theme of Israel dominance again, the wealth, the power, the Western support behind closed doors versus Arab incompetency and division. Arabs were not prepared to have a fully functional army of this magnitude. And we are going to again see that on display. So after we saw with 56, with the crisis, Nasser agreed, and we covered that in our last section, as part of a UN agreement, they would go back to the armistice lines. You would allow United Nations troops to be stationed to enforce these armistice lines that were set out in 1949, which we covered in part 4. So back to the armistice lines, UN peacekeepers being brought in, Nasser agreed. We talked about how the Zionists agreed to the ceasefire, but as usual, they were not going to let the peacekeepers in their land. That was not going to happen. So during this period of time of relative peace, there were minor border clashes that would erupt between Israel and the Arab neighbors. Syria would sign a mutual defense pact in 66, which basically means they attack us, it's like attacking you. We're here to help each other, support each other. Declaration of war on one is a declaration of war on the other. PLO guerrilla activity was off the ground and running, as we talked about a little bit in 65. You would see a little bit more here, mine attacks, killing 3 Israelis. This would cause a retaliatory effort by the IDF on the village of Asamu in the West Bank. So now we're starting to see that battle line being drawn over there in the Eastern Theater. King Hussein of Jordan would be irate that Nasser never reinforced or backed him up, claiming that he was hiding by the United Nations peacekeeping forces' skirts. Hiding under their skirts was a common, insult at the time, calling you a coward, saying that you don't want to get involved. So after this Israeli attack on what was considered Jordanian territory, King Hussein is now lashing out, at Nasser. The Soviet Union would send reports to Nasser that Israel was amassing basically on the Syrian border in May of 67. And because of that defense pact, this was seen again as the beginnings of an act of war. So starting on May 19th, Nasser would start amassing troops and then he would expel all the United Nations peacekeepers from Gaza and Sinai. So he's preparing based on Russian intelligence. He's defending his borders, ready to reinforce the lines. He would also take over the positions at Sharm el-Sheikh, which overlooked the Straits of Tiran, which we covered in the last part, how important that whole Suez Canal, Tiran, area was for trade. So on May 22nd, just 3 days later, part 2, Nasser would again close the straits to Israel shipping. Israel, as we covered in part 6, had stated at the conclusion of the Sinai crisis that any closure of this in the future was an act of war and was justification for war. That was it for them, because we saw how this would cripple basically the trade in the region. Their need to get supplies, oil, also cutting a line. Now you'd have to sail all around Africa to get to Western Europe. This was a big deal, and we pretty much highlighted the strategic importance of that canal in the past part. So now it's happening again. So now you would have Jordan and Egypt also signing a defense pact. The Iraqi army would start deploying troops and armor divisions to Jordan. Egypt would also reinforce that very key points there in the West Bank as well. So as the preparation is building, Israel's been thoroughly training during this period of time, as they always were. And we've highlighted how they've always used these ceasefires and these peace agreements as an opportunity to build and get better at what they do. So what they were doing was they were training their men in rapid refilling of their aircraft. To get to be so good at this process, you could almost do it in your sleep, just bang, 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 bang. And the term sortie, a sortie means a plane mission. One sortie is like, as an example, aircraft would fly over, do a bombing mission, and then return. That was considered to be a sortie. If you had 12 planes doing the same thing, it would be called 12 sorties in military terminology. So basically, the Israelis were preparing pretty much one aircraft each to do 4 of these runs per day. And they were doing numerous drills on this: the refueling, the launch, the reconnaissance of the strike, simulations, turning around, refueling, rinse, and repeat. Opposed to the Arabs, who were only preparing for 2 such of these per day. So Israel was preparing for this very rapid Air Force strikes, one after another, back to back to back, really to cripple, as we're going to see here, any Arab chances of owning the skies. So very well trained, using their time wisely, getting everything organized. Their pilots were also schooled in their missions to the finest of details. I mean, we're talking about being able to pretty much have this terrain mapped out in the mind. This is pre-days of computer-generated flight simulators. You had to do this stuff in real time. And they were getting their pilots refreshed, knowledgeable, to the point, again, they were described as being able to envision this territory fully detailed in the mind. That is how thorough they were training. All this is going on, and what do we see from the Muslims, basically? Nothing, even on the level of this type of preparation. One of my favorite hadiths that relates to this point is the famous hadith of a man who came to the Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he asked him, should I just leave my camel here and trust in Allah? And the Messenger said, absolutely not. You tie your camel, then you trust in Allah. And that hadith can be applicable to so many situations in life. I mean, I could say, oh, I want to be a doctor. Allah, make it happen. Then happen. Oh, Allah, you cursed me. No, absolutely not. I need to do the work and trust in Allah. And He will guide me with the motivation, the wisdom, the determination to achieve such goals. And hard work pays off, whether it's to serve evil in this case or to serve good. And we just didn't see this level of preparation, basically, from the Arabs. The Israeli army at this time would bolster a total strength of 264,000 men. The Egyptian army would have about 160,000. 100K would be in Sinai, and this would include all 7 of their main divisions. Syria would field 75,000 during this conflict. Their forces were deployed exclusively on the northern theater of the border between Israel and Syria. Numerous commentators at the time would state there was never an army they had studied or read about that was more incompetent than the Syrian army at this point in time, going up against a superior foe. It was like, an equivalent of if anyone watches American sports and you see some of these small colleges and college football, and they're taking on the well-planned programs with all the money, and you see them get beat 85-0. I mean, it was that level as it was described by numerous military experts. I mean, we're talking a huge gap here in competency, organization, equipment. It was such a mismatch. There was never a foe. Syria had been going through numerous coups. The military had been involved in all of this nonsense. They weren't ready on any level, for what the monster that was about to be unleashed on them. The Jordanian forces total 11 brigades of 55,000. They were the most trained and most organized army in the Arab ranks. The Jordanians had been working side by side with the British, had been developed by the British. They were being trained by professionals. They had professional people. And as we are going to see in this conflict, they by far put up the biggest fight and the most resistance against the Israeli divisions. I mean, the Jordanians were the most seasoned, most well-equipped in this conflict, but we are going to see just total mismatches everywhere else across the board. Saudi Arabia would mobilize forces, very minor, but they sent forces to Jordan and would ultimately leave forces there as late as 77, much after this conflict is gone. Most of the weapons that were fielded by the Arabs during this time were old Soviet Union weapons, with the exception of Jordan, who again had deals with Britain. They were using weapons from both Britain and primarily from the United States, who was emerging itself, Russia and America, as being the two major arms dealers, in the world. It was like one side would have Soviet weapons, the Americans would arm this side over here, and both of them are laughing all the way to the bank, watching forces weaken themselves. Now, Egypt would have the largest air force of any of the Arab states. A total of 420 combat-ready aircraft. They would have Badger bombers. These were the most concerning to the Israelis because of their ability to inflict major damage on military and civilian targets. Bombers, if anyone's familiar with them, very high altitude, massive amounts of explosive potential can be dropped on cities, destroying infrastructure, wreaking havoc on supply chains and lines. So Israel was really concerned the most initially, as we were going to see how this war unfolds, with the Egyptian Air Force and their abilities to launch these attacks from above. So the first strike would be a surprise attack, even though both sides claimed the other ones had provoked it first. Israel would strike first blood in a surprise attack with the sole aim of decimating the Egyptian Air Force in one big, massive series of strikes. It happened on the 5th of June at 7:45. Israel would sound the civil defense systems all throughout their area, and they would officially deploy 188 of their 200 operational jets. So they're going for broke here. They're going really for what we call the jugular vein, so to speak. The goal was to completely eradicate all Egyptian air threats and their airfields. Now, we talked about incompetence earlier, and really no example that I can cover today is going to demonstrate this more than how this all unfolded. Egypt did not even have shelters in place in basic infrastructure to protect their aircraft. Their aircraft were just simply sitting side by side in the open air in an open field. And of course, Israel had been doing reconnaissance missions on this area. They knew where everything was. They knew how to hit them strategically, and that's exactly what they did. But no planning, no what ifs, no thinking, well, what if this happens? What are we going to do? Are we going to be prepared? Egyptian radar was very primitive, and we're going to see in a second, Israel just bypassed all of that altogether. So it's basically zero protections in place. Israeli warplanes would fly over the Mediterranean, low altitude, going underneath the Egyptian radar, not being detected. The entire Egyptian air system was also shut down. Fears of rebels potentially attacking a plane carrying the Field Marshal Abdel Hakim Amir and the Lieutenant General Sadiq Mahmoud. This was a minor concern since Israelis were below the Egyptian radar anyway and probably would not have been detected. But even the little bit they had, they were dealing with internal strife, and it was shut down, as well. Now, the Jordanian facilities were much more sophisticated and much more ready, and they detected this activity. Problems, however, with Egyptian communication channels prevented the warnings from actually getting to the airfields. So even the Jordanians detected it. They sent messages out, but Egypt had such poor communication channels that they couldn't relay these messages in to release these planes. So the planes are just sitting there like sitting ducks. So the operation for the Israelis or the Zionists was a roaring success. It shattered their own expectations of what they hoped to achieve. They were caught with their pants down, as the old saying goes, completely shocked, surprised, decimated. 338 Egyptian aircraft were destroyed, during this. We talked about earlier how they had the most equipped air force, in the entire, Arab world. And at this point now, we're seeing 328 being just completely decimated. 100 pilots killed, during this attempt. The Israelis would only lose 19 planes. Mostly were down by the anti-aircraft artillery, which started firing after the Israeli presence was already known. So very late response again. They did get 19, but also during this time, Israel would destroy the radar system, further giving them total supremacy, as we're going to see them use this in the coming days in their infantry advancements. This air control was huge. They were able to drop paratroopers, as we're going to see, behind lines, moving troops around, dropping supplies. I mean, they owned the skies in a matter of hours. I mean, just like that. Now, there were accusations by the Egyptian side stating basically that these attacks were over exaggerated. This was not a total victory. In fact, a lot of Egyptians had said they had, had a resounding victory here. But the lack of Arab air presence in the skies from this moment forward lends me to say the Zionists on this side are actually telling the truth. They did decimate this Air Force because we don't see really anything else from the Egyptian Air Force for the duration of this conflict, which tends to lend truth to the Israeli claims that they eradicated the Egyptian airfields in a matter of hours on the first day, of this conflict. So simultaneously, another great thing the Zionists did was they coordinated. They worked well, together. They're not dealing with ego and all these things that plague the Arab world. And the northernmost Israeli division would cross the border south of Khan Yunis. Egyptian forces would bolster 4 divisions here. Israelis would suffer heavy losses, but cleared the Egyptian positions and reached the railway junction. Now they would move to Rafah, where they would also face fierce Egyptian resistance. But by nightfall, the Israelis would control the area. 2,000 Egyptians would be killed, 40 tanks would be lost. So we're seeing it here now in the ground theater as well, as they are moving into Gaza. Fault number 4, they didn't want to occupy Gaza back in 56. They were not ready yet. They didn't feel they could control it, but now they know they're ready, and they're ready to go and seize. Also following more fierce fighting, they would take Arish and capture the airport there as well, further taking control of the skies. Now, our familiar face, Ariel Sharon, he was commanding troops, led an assault on what they call Katif. 16K Egyptian men would fortify the forts. Using their control of the skies, however, the Israelis would flank them from behind, silence their artillery. So basically, they would come in, drop the paratroopers behind. So you've got an engagement here in the front lines. They're flying over, dropping men in behind, destroying your artillery. All of a sudden, you're in just a world of hurt. Again, the importance of why they struck the way they did. They knew what they were going to do. Ariel Sharon's division would continue to advance. They did suffer a lot of casualties, however. There was major shelling, minefields set up everywhere. Israelis, the IDF, would have to employ all their various engineers to be able to go in and go through these and detonate, or not detonate, but deactivate these mines. Israel would fire, however, 6,000 shells into Katif. This was the most ever fired by Israeli artillery in history at the time. And after fierce fighting, they would capture Katif. The Israelis would lose 14 men, only, while the Egyptians would estimate a loss of 300, just inching towards Sinai. And with the exception of Khan Yunis and Rafah, Israel wanted to avoid at this time entering Gaza. After heavy firing was made on Israeli settlements in response, the decision was now made they would also enter Gaza. They knew all along that there would be some retaliatory action. This, I believe personally, was in the plans from the beginning, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. By sunset, Israel would take the Ali Mukhtar Ridge, which overlooked the city, but further advancements were halted. With further reinforcements, however, coming by way of paratroopers, Israel would again capture the city of Gaza, and we are still, as Muslims, plagued with this to this day. Gaza basically has been under occupation. We're going to talk later as we build up about the relationships between the people of these cities and their new occupiers. And obviously, it was not a beneficial union, to say the least. The remaining remnants of the Egyptian Air Force would try to attack Israeli ground forces. and they eventually were destroyed. They took losses from the Israeli Air Force, which was quickly deployed to attack them. After hearing about the fall of Abu Agilia, Abdel Hakim Amr would order all units in Sinai to retreat. So as Sharon's forces continued to push, all Egyptian forces would pull out of Sinai. Sharon's forces would find numerous amounts of abandoned equipment. They created 3 mechanized divisions and 2 armored brigades just from abandoned Egyptian equipment only. By June 8th, most of Sinai would be in the hands of Israelis. This is going into the third day, ending the third day of the war. They had already taken it in 3 days. They built 2 mechanized divisions, 3 armored divisions, numerous slaughter we're going to talk about later of the Egyptians who were left behind, who were abandoned in many cases. I mean, it was in the summer, by the way, as well, in the middle of June, beginning of June, I'm sorry, in the desert. I mean, it's obviously the weather there. If anyone's ever been in that region, it's not cool. It's not chilly. And these were very, very harsh conditions, to say the least. Now, Israeli aircraft wouldn't stop, obviously. They would continue attacking Egyptian forces, now using napalm bombs during their sorties. So their missions now with the purpose of dropping napalm. If anyone's not familiar with that, just look it up. I mean, it is horrendous. And yeah, I mean, this is, again, the type of warfare that was being, launched, on people there. There was an area known as the Gidi Pass, which was a strategic point of interest in Sinai. And this would see 10,000 Egyptians killed in one day alone. And numerous of those were men dying of thirst. And again, this was a pass that became like a murder canyon, a canyon of death, a pass there through the hot desert. You're being bombed from artillery long range. I mean, the horrors that these men must have mentally and physically gone through during this period of time. Death would have almost been welcomed. I mean, just constantly being shelled, shots being fired everywhere around you, from air, from land. I mean, and you're dealing, of course, with extreme heat and thirst. Now, before that, a day before, we talked about 8th, they would completely capture the Sinai Peninsula. On the 7th of June, they would take the city of Sharm el-Sheikh, killing 20 more Egyptians. As well, basically on June 8th, they would completely take over, as I mentioned before, all of Sinai. So that was all done deal. Sharm el-Sheikh was the last to fall. This was total annihilation in every aspect of warfare. I've been, someone who's been into warfare, most of my life, looking at the American Civil War particularly. And I had never seen, until I started studying this time period, any kind of, again, a mismatch, like this. I mean, just how thorough, coordinated, armed the Israelis were. They had been planning this for a long time. And again, we're going to talk about, the little mystery assistance, if you will, that America and France and England were supplying them. I mean, it was really, you're dealing with the ultimate colonizers, the baddest colonizers on the block, if you will, people who made warfare art. People who have been the best at warfare in human history, all working together on the same side, for the same sinister, agenda. Now we turn to the West Bank, and this on tragedy unfolding here. So King Hussein had given control of his army and their defense pact to Egypt on the 1st of June. The Israeli objective was to fight a defensive campaign here along the Jordanian front, while being offensive against the Egyptians. At this juncture, they wanted to make sure the Egyptians were completely immobilized, decimated, demoralized, and they were going to hold off as long as they could in a defensive type strategy. We'll see. That will change. There would be small, skirmishes, machine gun exchanges beginning in Jerusalem around the 5th. The Jordanian army began launching strikes on Tel Aviv. So now, for the Israelis, this was even more of a need for them to feel they had to escalate. King Jordan was sent a correspondence asking him to stay out of the war in exchange for no action against Jordan from their side. So the Israel and its allies would not molest Jordan, not do anything to Jordan, but King Hussein would have to stay out. Well, he would state that it was too late for that. There's no way he could accommodate that request. And I mean, King Hussein basically cared about his own power ultimately. In the end of the day, as we've covered in previous lectures, and he knew what would happen to him at home. He was looking out for his power. And I think at the time he didn't really realize how lopsided the victory would be. He was fearful of losing his throne. So he stayed in. Jordanian forces would continue targeting Israeli settlements and sections of Jerusalem. This would prompt an Israeli retaliatory attack on 2 Jordanian air bases, control towers, and 21 Jordanian hunter fighters were destroyed, along with 6 aerial transport aircraft and 2 helicopters. So now Israel's going the same they did to the Egyptians to the Jordanians as well. They are using their superior air power to eliminate any air challenge, if you will, to them. They also would go after Western Iraqi forces during this period of time as well. They would decimate Jordan tanks, supply vehicles, and use these new missiles they had, L missiles, which were developed in secret between France and Israel, which went against the embargoes that were placed. Remember, we talked about this in previous episodes. The West was not allowed to arm them. They wanted this conflict, according to the United Nations, to be stabilized. They didn't want arms races going off to perpetuate the fighting. But we are seeing the French working here with the Israelis to help them with new missiles, that were able to just decimate Jordanian military positioning. So you have, again, other advance of an unfair fight. So the area known as the government house outside of Jerusalem will be seized by Israel, and the Jordanians would suffer 100 casualties. Now, this fighting was very intense. There was a lot of guerrilla warfare, back-to-back, people shooting from windows, from roofs. There was a lot of, the horror it must have been to be a civilian in this area during this period of time. It just can't be put into words. Now, next, the Israelis will begin to encircle, Jerusalem. The heavy dug-in Jordanian forces would fiercely, resist. They killed numerous Israeli officers. The fighting would often be hand-to-hand, the most brutal type of combat you find in warfare. 4 hours of heavy fighting, Israel would capture what they known as the position of Ammunition Hill. Ammunition Hill is a famous battle in Zionist history that they look to as a triumph, in this conflict. And after that, they would start taking position after position with a lot of intense fighting. There was a lot of mines in there. We talked about guerrilla warfare and now trench warfare as well, because we mentioned Jordanians were dug in. They were here to basically die in some way defending these positions. So this was very violent, very bloody. As we said, oftentimes it came to hand-to-hand combat. Now, while this was going on, Egypt had an idea of taking their commandos and secretly moving them around Israeli airfields to do some attacks, to try to eliminate some of that air superiority that was going on. But the difference was Israel had the air superiority. They were constantly engaged in reconnaissance, intelligence missions. They detected the commandos easily. Israel set fire to numerous shelters, leaving these commandos nowhere to settle, nowhere to seek shelter, and then they massacred them. 450 of them were killed after this failed attempt to try to get some of this pressure off of them. But again, scouting, air reconnaissance, Israel was second to none, in this conflict. Jordanian tanks now would move, but Israel's Air Force also saw every movement and would destroy them. Jordanian tanks were known for having their fuel sources external, outside of the tank. So Jordanians will lose basically half of their tanks here easy, as the Israelis would target those fuels, external fuel systems, destroying them, also in turn destroying the tanks. There would be multiple attempts by Jordan to reinforce Jerusalem, met with fierce airstrikes, along with long-range rocket and cannon fire. And due to their fear of fierce international backlash, Israelis were forbidden at this time from entering the Old City. They feared a huge Christian response, because these are very sacred sites, obviously, to the Christians. And if they were desecrated or destroyed, you would have the Christian world and the Muslim world up in arms over this. So they had to be very delicate here. They're still this way today. They understand how to try to win the PR through their control of the media. They know they're always going to get a favorable presentation there, but they can't go too far in certain areas or the backlash would be massive. So Israel would gain almost total control of the West Bank by the evening of June 7th. Egyptian forces had ordered King Hussein to withdraw, but he was hoping for a ceasefire so he could hold on to the territory. But upon Israel hearing this, that there was about to be a ceasefire declared by the UN, an Israel commander goes by the name of Dayan, decided, okay, without cabinet clearance, and it's not the first time he's going to do this. We are going to see more from this gentleman later. We got to hit him now. And he marched in to capture the old city of Jerusalem. He said, the enemy's weak. They're preparing for a ceasefire. We can't let the ceasefire happen. We've got to go in there now. We can capture the old city, control of Jerusalem, which has been promised since the beginning as an international city, would now fall on the Zionist hands. And once the old city fell, Israel continued to capture Judea, Gush, its Zion, Hebron, without any resistance. And on June 7th, they would seize control of Bethlehem. And by the night of June 7th, the Jordanian army would order a full withdrawal. Israel was now unprecedented, the ruler of the West Bank and of Jerusalem. So they'd gotten something that was never even promised in their wildest dreams. They got Jerusalem. It's an international city. And we see what has happened. Donald Trump moving the United States Embassy there to Jerusalem, them declaring it the capital. They're not giving it back. We covered that in part 4 when they passed legislation at the end of the Arab-Israeli war stating any territory we get, we're not giving it back. The only time they did that you could see was with the Suez crisis. And that's only because America told them, you guys, probably should back off. So Sinai, Gaza, West Bank, one more fight left to have in this 6-day war, and it would be the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights is known for its rough terrain, water. It's very strategical importance for the Zionists to control. So Syria was largely out of this conflict. We haven't mentioned Syria except in the beginning. We talked about them being there. We talked about the 75,000 troops. Syria had been getting intelligence, false reports claiming there was a crushing set of Egyptian victories, that Egypt was crushing, Israel. So the decision to enter was now taken based on false intel. 12 Syrian jets would begin attacking Israeli positions in Galilee. We had covered that in the 49 war, how Israel had taken complete control of southern and northern Galilee. Israel would retaliate and just crush the Syrian Air Force, destroying 3 of the 12 dispatched fighters, chasing the other ones away. On June 5th, Israel would destroy the Syrian airfields, same thing they'd done the previous 2 theaters, and they would destroy a total of 51 Syrian aircraft, just, again, decimating them. Not even a fair fight. Syria's efforts a large time in this war can be summed up by incompetence again. Poor coordination. Tanks were sinking in the Jordan River. You were having bridges that were too narrow for tanks to cross. Lack of radio communication. Units were completely ignoring orders. I mean, it was even worse of a mess than what we had seen in Egypt. I mean, we were talking about how good Israelis' reconnaissance were. Pilots had memorized terrain before they would carry their mission. We saw how fast they used their reconnaissance to identify the 450 Egyptian commandos. Here you have Syria. There's a bridge there and the tanks can't cross it. Or the Jordan River having tanks sinking. I mean, this is just a mess on so many levels, total incompetence. And again, we're dealing with a culture of high nepotism. Officers are wealthy only, no chance for, studious, smart, bright minds to rise to the top. Everything there is hierarchical. I have cousins in the family who are still telling me these stories. It's going on to this day. It has not stopped. So total incompetence. Now, Israel had considered conquering the Golan Heights, but they feared the terrain. This was the only thing holding him back. In this terrain, you've got up to 17,000 feet of elevations. You've got uphill battles, which in warfare has always been problematic when you're talking about, coming uphill. troops are tired. They can see your move from farther away. This is kind of high ground was more important pre-air days, but still it is very important when you're talking about moving battalions, artillery, tanks. There's sets of valleys. I mean, just really killing cauldrons, can go on in terrain like this. But Israel would intercept a very important message between Nasser and the Syrian command. He was urging them to accept the ceasefire. Syria would accept, and again, Dayan, we talked about him before, he was going in because he saw right now they want to quit. They're not ready to fight. We have to get them now. So for the second time, this gentleman, just like he did with Jerusalem, he went without government approval. He gave the orders, we're going to go ahead. So Syrian forces, again, also another point, were known for their low morale. They were treated like animals by the command, again, something that still goes on to this day. Officers were commonly known to run, abandoning the battlefield, leaving the men there without direction. These are not leaders. These men were never trained to lead. They didn't have this ability. The commanders would flee and leave them there. And again, newsflash, it has not changed. It's the same system, same type of people running it to this day. So a period of 2 days of basically up close fighting again. This was described again, very close, tank on tank, close range, not a lot of maneuverability as they were fighting through here. Syrian forces would flee, evacuate under panic and chaos, leaving behind again equipment in perfect condition. Tanks that were fully operational, no issues. Israel's like, okay, we'll take those gladly. And again, more and more territory. By June 10th, Israel completed its final offensive and captured the Golan Heights. And then the next day, there came the ceasefire. Right on time, right on schedule, allowed them to go through and capture every bit of territory they had coveted. And the Golan Heights was a very quick 2-day campaign, not a lot of fighting, very easy victories. And as I said in the opening, it was considered by many warfare experts as the biggest mismatch in war history. So in just a period of 6 days, again, Gaza, Sinai, West Bank, East Jerusalem, Golan Heights, 1 million Arabs now were under Israeli control. 1 million. These were territories previously considered to be part of a two-state solution. Now 1 million of them were under Israeli direct control. They would never be offered citizenship, even if they wanted it. Obviously, they would never have the right to have a country again to this present day. Those same people still do not have a country. Israel would gain a total of 300 kilometers of territory in the south, 60 in the east, 20 kilometers of territory in the north. Total death tolls between 776 and 993 Israelis would be killed, with 4,517 wounded. We would see between 9,800 and 15,000 Arabs killed during this period of time. So we are talking again 10 to 1, in some estimates 15 to 1 in terms of casualties through here. Another side note, for those of you who may or may not have seen a presentation I did in October, the end of October of last year, when I called the presentation Israel, America's Greatest Ally. And I chronicled in that, with evidence, all the backstabs and betrayals that Israel had basically done to the United States, but yet we still hear from the media, oh, our best friend in the region. We had a politician the other day say, if Israel falls, the whole world will fall. And it's like, this ridiculous level of dramatization from these people. But we see the first major, point here of how much Israel really loves us. How much is that love reciprocated? Because in June 8th, during this war, we have the famous USS Liberty attack, which I talked about in a little bit more detail in that presentation than I will tonight. But we saw 34 sailors and 171 wounded. Israel's goal here was to blame this on Egypt because Israel doesn't like to fight. They prefer to have the Westerner, the Goyim, fight for them. So they wanted to bring America into the war. And this would have been a very good way of doing it. You pretend that Egypt was attacking, American ships. The goal was to kill and sink the ship. But fortunately, I mean, our soldiers are pretty well trained. We can hold our own against them. And our brave Arab shipmen here were able to defend themselves. I mean, with 34 did unfortunately die, 171 were wounded, but we fended off the attack and we got the distress signals out. Our government hid this attack from the American people. In fact, the medals of honor given to these men for their bravery, for saving the ship and saving the lives of their crewmen, were given in the basements, not in public like is customary, where people can celebrate their bravery and their accomplishment. This was hidden in hidden ceremonies because they did not want the American people to know that Israel had attacked us, trying to kill Americans, who were just their reconnaissance. They weren't engaged, in the war on either side. So we see again the first of many times. We will see the Lavon affair coming up later, where they will dress like Arabs and attack civilian targets in Egypt, trying to bring Britain and the United States again on their side. So the USS Liberty would be a side note that also occurred in this war, a very famous incident. After the Six-Day War, we would see a further displacement of 1 million Palestinians. We saw 750,000 had already fled during the 49 war. We already saw a major diaspora there. Between 280,000 and 325,000 in Gaza and in the West Bank. Most of these people would settle in Jordan, while 700,000 would remain. So out of the millions affected, you would have 700,000 would stay out of this groups here in these two areas. 280 to 325 would then go to Jordan. And we see a lot of Palestinians were in Jordan still to this day. Now, Israel would only allow residents of East Jerusalem and Golan Heights to receive full citizenship. So you weren't allowed basically to get citizenship if you stayed, if you left, it did not matter. We'll get to the return policy here in a second. Homes were burned, and they were considered by Israeli IDF commanders as punishment to the Palestinian people who were civilians. These were not people with guns. They were not artillery, but they were treated as they were enemy combatants. It was stated that the goal was to discourage them from staying and make them go. Dayan would write in his memoirs that 1/3 of the homes were destroyed. 12,000 people were evicted. These are in areas that he saw in the southwest area of Jerusalem. These cities were not involved in any of the battles. They were not stationing troops. These were innocent people who were living there, scared out of their minds, and 1/3 of them had their homes burned. Another 12,000, as we said, were completely evicted from these areas. 1/4 of the population of the West Bank went into exile. Both claims that the IDF soldiers went around with loudspeakers demanding they leave and head to Jordan. So they were told, blasted by loudspeakers, you need to get out, you go to Jordan, or else pretty much you're going to have no home, we're going to kill you, whatever happens. Either the heat's going to get you, the dehydration's going to get you. It's best for you to pack up and leave. They wanted them out of there, just like they want them out of there today. They want to send them to other countries. At the time, it was Jordan, it was Lebanon. Some went to Egypt, obviously. Now they're wanting them to send them to America. They're wanting to send them to Canada. They're wanting to send them to Britain. They're trying to get all the people from Gaza to leave. It's always been about this. They want the land, but they know they can't grab it too quickly. Now, Israel, the tip of a sign here of their supposed compassion, they would give cement and some tools to allow them to partially rebuild their homes. So some of the people who did stay, despite threats, the warnings, the fears, oh, here's some cement and some basic tools and whatever you can, go ahead, do it, no problem. I mean, how compassionate of them, being sarcastic, obviously. Israel would state that refugees were allowed to return, so the people who had fled initially, they would be allowed to return, but no later than August 10th. So 1 full month after the war. And they would later extend this to September 13th because they knew. I mean, these people were tired, worn out, poor at this point. They had relocated. It would be very difficult for them to mobilize and move. Now, Jordan pressured many of the refugees to go back. Jordan didn't want to take care of them. Jordan didn't want basically them to be outside these territories to further allow Israeli expansion, but Jordan was urging it. But out of basically 14,000 that applied, 120 were allowed back in. So even when they're telling you that you're allowed back in, you're still not really allowed back in, pending review. And again, this is a problem that we still face to this day with these Palestinian people of no home. They live in these Arab nations. They get no nationality, no representation. Their children in some places like Saudi Arabia, they can't go to college. College is for Saudis only in rare exceptions. I mean, you're raised in Saudi, you work, 30, 40 years in Saudi. You have a son, you want him to be an engineer. Not in Saudi, buddy. Go somewhere else. But we're your Muslim brothers, remember that. It's always just very disgusting. And when you ask any of the people, oh, we're helping them. Because if we give them our nationality, then Israel will never take them back. Well, Israel's not going to take them back. Israel's not going to give up any land. They've got legislation stating they're not going to give up any land without, obviously, military action against them. So this claim is just completely moronic. They have no sympathy for these people and their plight whatsoever. You're having them there. You want to use them for cheap labor, but you don't want to give them even basic rights to go to college, to own a business, to prosper. None of these things. You see this in all these Arab, Middle Eastern countries. I've visited them, same song and dance in every single one of them. And it's just absolutely disgusting. And we see again here where we left off. I mean, what's happened now is what we're seeing today. In 1967, it all can be traced back. The Gaza problem, the occupations, not having your own land. I mean, we all can go back and see that. And we're going to close here. As we progress further, next week, we will go into the 1970s, the age of guerrilla warfare and tactics. We are going to see an escalation of that, numerous peace attempts, promises, hollow, but promises made, two-state solutions being talked about again. A lot of times the calls will start saying pre-67 borders. We'll start to cover some of that stuff as we progress in this series.